All right, class, welcome back. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving break. So this week we're going to jump back into soils, which is chapter 9 of our online textbook. And we're going to finish up talking about soils, different types of soils, and how soils form. And then we'll be moving on to chapter 10, which is going to be diving into the lithosphere. So talking about plate tectonics, rocks, and minerals. So you guys should be reviewing chapter 9 and then moving forward and starting chapter 10 on our online textbook. The link's provided below. Okay, so where we left off, we talked about the soil water budget. And so as we talked about last week, we talked about this particular time period during the calendar year where there was a deficit of soil water versus a surplus of soil water. And the deficit takes place where we have evapotranspiration taking place. We have a wilting point where the vegetation starts to wilt due to this deficit of soil water. And typically, this deficit period takes place June, July, and August, which corresponds really to our solar budget. That we could transpose this onto our subsolar point and solar budget, and it really matches the calendar months. We also can identify the surplus of soil water, so those are going to be our winter wet months. So a good chart to remember in delineating and identifying the surplus and deficit. Now we left off talking about what are basic properties of soil, and we identified that the soil can be saturated or it can be dry. If it's saturated, it has limited air space, but if it's dry, you're going to have more soil particles and more air space with less water. And we know that soils form and evolve through a sequence of time and soil forming processes. The first one is that we have to have an addition of organic matter, where we have water as precipitation and condensation and runoff, where we have a combination of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, where we have minerals from precipitation, where we have sediments blown from the wind or carried by water, and we have energy from the sun. So all of these elements contribute to our soil additions, meaning that they're going to be adding up on the soil. The next one is we have soil depletion, where we have aspects of the soils are lost through an element of weathering or erosion. We call that elements can be lost via wind, water, erosion, could be also carried by snow, could be carried by, could be caused by erosion of landslides, so a loss or soil depletion. We also then have translocation. So this is going to be the vertical movement through the soil. And that vertical movement is going to allow for decomposition. So this decomposition of minerals and organic matter. So the vertical movement is going to allow for the stuff that's breaking down at the surface to be carried through the additional layers. So in talking about our soil forming process, we have our living plants and our grasses at the very top. Then we have our area of dead and decaying matter that starts to accumulate at the surface. And then we move into our transformation of organic matters into humus by decay. So humus is a soil terminology that's used to describe organic matter that's starting to break down. So moving from our transformation into our translocation, we start to have dissolved minerals that are then carried downward through a process that we have defined. So the process of downward movement is alluviation. And so this is the dissolution of downward motion of minerals that's carried down through the soil by water. So alluviation is where those minerals are recrystallized and start to become deposited in this particular zone. So we have this accumulation zone of minerals that are then recrystallized. So factors that are consistently affect how soils form are going to be identified below. So there's 5 factors that are going to be consistent with soils. The first one is going to be parent material. The second one is climate. Third one is organisms. The fourth one is relief. And the fifth one is time. So make sure these get into your notes, and I'll be detailing and outlining the specifics. So when we talk about parent material, literally what we're talking about is what the rock is made up of. When that rock breaks down, that starts to form soil particles. So we're talking about the sediment in which the soil forms and related to the geology of a certain region. And we'll be talking about different types of rocks later on in this lecture. So when we talk about the breaking apart of rocks into smaller pieces, that's referred to as weathering. So we can take apart residual parent materials, break it apart, and we now have sediments from rocks that weathers in different place. It weathers in place. Now, weathering is basically the breakdown and movement of these particles. So that could be in the form of wind blowing or through water or landslides. And when we talk about the term regolith is a small fragments of weathered rock that we see much lower in the soil profile. And we know that these parent materials, once they start breaking down, they're transported. They're carried by wind, water, glaciers, from where it was weathered to its resting point. So this diagram right here shows the cross section of where we see our soil, where we start to see our residual parent material. So our regoliths are going to be the blocks of the bedrock that's broken up into pieces that we see higher up in the soil profile. We can also see our layer of soil. We start to see our bedrock here on this cross section here, and we see bits and pieces of our regolith on the diagram. Okay, climate's going to have a huge factor for soils. Just like when we talked about biomes and we talked about Kirpin climographs, climate's going to have a huge factor in relationship to the temperature and moisture that influences the kind of biological influences, and then also the rate of chemical reactions in the soil. And so what we're looking at here is this is a limestone temple in Thailand. And notice that we have some sort of erosion or breakdown of the limestone structure. And this is related directly to acid rain and the moist, humid climate in this particular region of the world. So as I just mentioned, there's going to be a greater reaction, a chemical reaction in warm, wet conditions. So as a result, there's going to be thicker, more developed soils as of this warm, wet conditions. We know that the wetter soil is going to have more of the accumulation of minerals. So the transpiration and transportation of downward movement from water to deposits. And we see that more so in wet, humid climates. We know that organisms are going to have a huge factor on our plants and animals that reside in the soils. Organisms are great transports and being able to provide air pockets within the soil structure. We know that they help break down organic matter. And so these organisms are in the form of animals, of birds, of insects, worms. We also have bacteria, fungi, and all of these are going to help provide nutrients, air pockets in the soil. And we call this bioturbidation, where the organisms are mixing of the soils, rearranging areas near the plant roots, and these are associated with the burrowing animals and also insects. We know that earthworms are an important factor when it comes to soil recycling. We also know that microorganisms help break down the organic matter to form humus. Now, remember, humus forms at the surface of the soil. So it's going to be the breakdown and decay of all the organic matter. It's going to be leaves, roots, plants that die and fall on the floor of a forest. When working up in Alaska, you definitely could identify the humus layer because it was about 8 to 10 inches thick, sometimes even thicker, up to 2 feet, where it was just a layer of decayed organisms that you had to dig through. Now, the fourth factor is going to be relief. Now, relief is basically identifying the differences between highs and lows in the landscape. So we often refer to the mountains having a high relief and a flat area, valleys, plains as an area of low relief. So relief is going to be a huge factor because it's going to really add to how much soil can form in certain areas. So we know that relatively soil's thin and poorly developed on steep slopes because we have gravity. That's going to be a big contender. And we know that sediment deposition is greater in areas where there's low relief. So where it's going to reach its resting place is going to allow for a more thicker humus layer and much more rich organisms to develop and a much better soil quality because it's in a lower relief. And this makes sense why Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, we have such nice soil for agriculture. And then time is going to be a huge factor. The longer time a soil exists on stable surfaces, this is going to allow for a greater soil development. So for all of the factors that we talked about above, time is going to be a huge factor. Now, when we talk about soils in a low resting area, for example, on a floodplain, we identify that soils can be up to 10,000 years old on a floodplain, and versus looking at time on soils that attempt to develop on a sand dune of some sort. So soils can be they're more stable on a floodplain. Obviously, we need to talk about, the movement and erosion of those soils on floodplains when we have floods and flooding events. But we can just by looking at the time of the soils are going to be relatively longer lasting and more stable on a floodplain than it's going to be on the development of a sand dune. Now we can see how certain cultures around the world take high reliefs and turn them into benches and terraces that allow for agriculture to take place. And we can see these types of rice benches all over Indonesia and Thailand and China. And this allows for a stable environment, to have a very flat, stable environment that allows for sediment to collect at the base of these berms instead of being washed away by the relief. So we talked about the 5 different ways that soils form. Now we need to talk about the physical properties that are used to distinguish soil types. So just by when we were talking about the Kirpin's climate classification and different biomes, we know that there are certain means in which soil scientists identify certain types of colors in soils by their color, texture, structure, and their soil chemistry and their soil pH. Now, if we look at the color of a soil, typically, a rule of thumb, a humus layer is going to be very dark, very rich, because of the organic matters breaking down. Another kind of rule of thumb in color is if you're looking at a reddish soil, you're typically looking at an area that is going to have a high iron-rich soil content that's going to give it the reddish color. Now, the color scheme that soil scientists use is the Munchell color chart, and it's based on 3 factors. So they're looking at hue, they're looking at value, and they're looking at chroma. So the hue is going to be the composition of light, reflection. The value is going to be the lightness and darkness of the soil, and the chroma is going to be the strength of that color. Another element that they're looking at is texture. So there's 3 sizes. There's 3 size categories for soil particles. You're going to be looking at the sand, which is the largest, silt, and clay is going to be the smallest. So texture and also the size of that particle is going to have a huge influence. In looking at the textural triangle of soils, this is actually a really cool chart that allows for a certain percentage of soils to be identified, and basically the percentage that you're looking at here is going to be how much silt exists, how much sand exists, and how much clay. And so the clay is going to be the horizontal line that we have on the left side. The silt is going to be the upper right, going from 100% silt down to 0% silt. I'm sorry, going from 0 silt to 100% silt. And then our horizontal, our x-axis here is going to be our percent sand. So, for example, the question below is going to be, what's the texture composition of soil if it's 50% sand? So we go to 50% right here.